He fixed the man's broken-down SUV in the rain, free of charge, only to be suspended a week later for violating company image. But here's what they didn't expect: the man he helped wasn't who they thought. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Henry Mathers had oil-stained hands, a stiff right knee, and the kind of eyes that had seen too much change. His small auto shop sat at the edge of Maple Hollow, a quiet town where the gas was cheaper than groceries and everyone knew your dog's name. He wasn't rich, not even close. The tin roof of his garage creaked in the wind, and the sign above his shop had lost its third letter long ago. But Henry still came in 6 days a week. Rain or shine, fixing cars was what he did, and he did it with a kind of quiet pride most folks forgot existed. He used to be a senior mechanical engineer at Cormac's Industrial, the kind of guy who knew how to rebuild a transmission with his eyes closed. But 20 years ago, after a company shake-up that favored politics over principles, he was asked to retire early. He packed his desk and never looked back. These days, the only title he cared for was Grandpa, and even that he wore gently. Emily, his 17-year-old granddaughter, was the brightest part of his life. She lived with him since her parents' passing, a quiet storm of empathy and sharp wit. She helped after school, answering phones, wiping counters, sometimes just sitting on the old couch in the corner of the garage. Headphones on, but always keeping an eye on him. She worried, though she'd never admit it out loud. She knew what the slow months did to his bills and what the ache in his knee meant on colder mornings. It was late in the afternoon when the rain started, not heavy, but steady enough to soak your collar and drip down your back. Henry was closing up shop when he spotted it. An older model SUV pulled to the shoulder about a quarter-mile down the road. The hood was up, and a man stood next to it, one hand on his hip, the other shielding his face from the rain. Something about the way he stood, out of place, like he didn't belong there, caught Henry's attention. He hesitated only a moment before grabbing his toolbox, motioning to Emily to stay put. She raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this? It's late, and that guy looks like he's from out of town." Henry just shrugged. "So was your grandmother, once." By the time he reached the SUV, the man was on his phone, clearly frustrated. His coat was damp, his shoes muddy, and there was a large tear near the elbow of his sleeve. He looked like someone who'd been on the road too long without much luck. "You need a hand?" Henry asked, already popping the hood with a practiced flick. The man looked surprised. "Was just calling for a tow truck. Battery's dead, I think. Don't have jumper cables. And, well, truth is, I'm running short on cash." Henry didn't flinch. "Don't worry about it. Let's get you moving first. We'll talk money if we make it to Christmas." The man blinked. "Seriously?" "Yep." Henry's hands worked without thinking, checking terminals, tightening connections, wiping moisture from the casing. 10 minutes later, he had the engine humming like a cat under a warm blanket. The stranger stared at him for a long moment. "You always fix cars for free?" Henry gave a half smile. "Not always. Just when someone needs it." Emily had wandered down, umbrella in hand. She stood quietly nearby, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She didn't say anything until they started packing up. "Grandpa, you don't even know who he is." "Don't need to," Henry said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sometimes it's enough to know someone's stuck and you can help." That used to mean something. She looked at him the way teenagers do when they want to argue but also know you're probably right. As the SUV's engine rumbled to life, the man rolled down his window. Rain streaked across the glass, but his eyes were focused. There was something there: curiosity, recognition, maybe both. "You used to be an engineer, didn't you?" he asked. Henry raised an eyebrow. "Cormac's? Back in 2001? The air changed. The sound of the rain seemed louder, and even Emily turned to look. Henry's mouth was dry. He hadn't heard that name out loud in years. He cleared his throat, but the words came slow. "Yeah, I was." The man nodded slowly, then shifted the gear into drive. "Thought so." And just like that, he was gone, tail lights fading into the mist. "No name, no thanks." No business card. Just that question. And the weight it left behind. The flyer was buried halfway down the bulletin board at the back of the library, tucked between a lost cat notice and a coupon for lawn service. Emily wasn't looking for anything in particular. She'd stopped by to print out an essay and, out of habit, scanned the board. What caught her eye wasn't the bold letters or a flashy design. It was the wording, "Seeking technical supervisor, integrity required." The phrase felt oddly specific, like it had been written for someone she knew. That night at dinner, while Henry scraped the last bit of mashed potatoes from his plate, she debated saying something. He looked tired, not just physically, but the kind of tired that comes from years of being overlooked. She waited until he got up to wash the dishes, then quietly slipped the flyer into her backpack. The next afternoon, while he was under a Dodge pickup replacing the brake lines, Emily sat at the front desk with a manila envelope. Inside was a copy of Henry's old resume, the one he never bothered updating but kept in a drawer, just in case. She'd scanned it into her laptop last year. She filled out the online application using his name, updated a few dates, polished the wording. She didn't mention it to him. Not yet. 2 days later, Henry found the envelope in the mailbox. It was thick, professionally sealed, with no return address except a simple emblem embossed in the corner, a stylized V inside a gear. The letter inside was short, direct, and carried an odd tone of familiarity. "We would like to invite Henry Mathers to a private interview for the technical supervisor role. Confidentiality is essential. Further instructions will follow via phone. Please do not bring recording devices or third-party attendees." Henry stared at the paper. Then read it again. He set it down, picked it back up. Something didn't feel right. He handed it to Emily over breakfast. "You know anything about this?" She chewed her toast slowly. "I may have seen something online. Thought it sounded like a good fit." He raised an eyebrow. "Emily, you helped that guy on the road without knowing his name. Why are you so sure this isn't someone helping you back?" He sighed and leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking beneath him. "People don't help out of nowhere, sweetheart. Not in business." She shrugged. "Maybe not, but what if, just once, someone does?" Later that day, Henry made a call to an old buddy from his Cormax days, Walt Green, who'd gone into HR consulting after retirement. Walt didn't recognize the company name but knew the symbol. "That V in a gear? That's Voltrix. A new player. Tech startup. Green infrastructure. Big on private funding. They've been hiring different lately. Some kind of character-based vetting." Character-based? They don't just look at your resume. They look at who you are, what you've done when no one's watching. That gave Henry pause. He hadn't updated his resume in years. Hadn't worn a suit in longer. And yet, somehow, they were inviting him, by name, to an interview. The directions arrived by text. A time, a date, and a location just outside of town. Inside a plain, unmarked office suite in a strip mall. It wasn't exactly what he expected. No receptionist, no company signs, just a door with frosted glass and the number 304. He almost turned back, but curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pushed him forward. Inside, the room was silent. A single chair sat near a low table. Across from it, a larger leather chair faced away from him. No papers, no screens, no nameplates, just the steady hum of an air vent and the faint tick of a wall clock. He sat. The leather crackled softly under his weight. After a long moment, a voice came from the chair opposite him. Calm, familiar. "You helped me last week. In the rain." No questions asked. Henry blinked. "That was you?" The chair turned. Gone were the muddy boots and tattered coat. In their place stood a man in a tailored gray suit, polished shoes, and a face shaved clean. He looked 10 years younger than he had on the side of the road. But the eyes were the same. Thoughtful, watchful. "My name is Richard Langston," he said. "I'm the founder of Voltrix." Henry didn't move. Richard continued. "I've spent years building a company that could change things, clean energy, smarter infrastructure, better ethics. But growth brings people, and people bring compromise." He folded his hands. "I don't want someone with the best credentials. I want someone who can't be bought. Someone who chooses right, even when no one's watching." Henry leaned forward slowly, unsure what to say. Richard smiled. "I need someone like you. Henry, and I think you still have something this world needs. Henry didn't say much on the drive home from the interview. The whole thing left a taste in his mouth he couldn't quite name, part curiosity, part suspicion. The rain from last week had given way to dry, cracked roads and the smell of sun-warmed asphalt. But something lingered. The moment Richard Langston stood from that leather chair, clean-cut and polished like a man from a different world, Henry felt something shift. He knew Richard had done his homework. That kind of offer doesn't land out of the blue. A few days later, a packet arrived. No letter, no contract, just a plain folder marked Voltrix, onboarding brief, and a small keycard wrapped in foil. A note was clipped to the front. Handwritten. Let's start simple. Walk the floor. Observe. I trust what you'll see. R. Henry showed it to Emily that evening over dinner. She read it twice, eyebrows tight. So, they want you to work there. But not actually work there? Seems like it, Henry said, pushing peas around his plate. Said I'll be a field advisor. No title, no office. Sounds shady. He nodded. Careful. He reported to the Voltrix Technical Center on Monday. The building was sharp-edged, all glass and brushed steel, with soft lighting and silent elevators. At the front desk, a woman scanned his card without a word and pointed toward a hallway that curved like a question mark. He walked slowly, taking in the air-conditioned silence, the neat rows of workstations, the low hum of machines in testing bays. At first glance, everything looked clean, efficient, but the longer Henry watched, the more cracks he noticed. Teams that should be collaborating barely made eye contact. The most competent-looking techs seemed to be sidelined into routine work, while the loudest voices sat in glass offices, laughing too loudly into headsets. One afternoon, while checking on a calibration station, a young man approached him. You're Henry, right? From the main floor? Henry looked up. The kid was lean, mid-20s, with oil-streaked fingers and eyes that carried more weight than his years should have allowed. Luis, the young man said, offering a quick nod. I heard you used to be with Cormax. That true? Henry gave a small shrug. A long time ago. Luis looked around before lowering his voice. Watch yourself here. This place is polished, but only on the outside. Guys like you, with a spine? They don't last. Henry arched an eyebrow. Meaning? Luis hesitated. People here figure out real fast that being honest makes you a target. You ask too many questions, you get reassigned. Keep asking? They streamline your role. That's code for don't come back Monday. He left without another word, blending back into the floor like he was never there. That night, Henry sat at the old workbench in his garage, looking over the printouts Richard had sent. Nothing stood out until he opened a folder marked Managerial Compensation, Internal Audit. He flipped through the names, titles, bonus structures. A few numbers didn't sit right. Too high, too frequent. And then he saw it, buried halfway down the list. Victor Dane, Senior Regional Director. He read the name again. Victor had been his direct supervisor at Cormax. The man who smiled across the table as he slid over Henry's forced resignation papers. Back then, Victor had talked about cutting dead weight and keeping things tight. And now here he was, not just employed, but thriving, promoted, hiding behind a new nameplate in a new company. Henry stared at the page for a long time, the edges crinkling under his fingertips. It wasn't just about the job anymore. Something deeper was unfolding, and it carried the same stench he remembered from years ago. But this time, it wasn't going to slide past unnoticed. Not if he had anything to do with it. Henry wasn't sure exactly when suspicion turned into certainty. But it had. It wasn't just the coincidence of seeing Victor Dane's name again. It was the cold certainty that the rot he'd once escaped hadn't just survived, it had spread. Voltrix, for all its shine and talk of progress, was starting to smell a lot like the same old game with a new coat of paint. He didn't tell Richard, not yet, maybe never. Instead, he turned to the one person he trusted more than anyone else in the world. Emily. At first, she was quiet when he laid it all out, the real reason he'd been brought in. The name he found on the payroll, and what it meant. She sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Are you saying that guy, Victor, he's working for the same company that hired you? She asked. Henry nodded slowly. Not just working, he's running a whole region. And you think that's not a mistake? I think it's a pattern. And I need to know how far it goes. Emily cracked her knuckles and pulled the laptop closer. All right, let's see what kind of footprint he left behind. They started small, public records, archived news, forgotten LinkedIn profiles. But it wasn't until Emily accessed a business registry through her student library portal that they found something odd. A trail of shell companies, all funded through one of Voltrix's regional partners, Clean Earth Holdings. On the surface, it looked like a sustainability initiative, but buried beneath were links to a private equity group once investigated for money laundering. And sitting on 3 of the board filings, under the name of financial authorization, was the same signature, Victor Dane. Henry leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. He's moving money through fronts. Same playbook as before, different setting. Over the next week, Henry walked the halls of Voltrix with new eyes. He spoke less, listened more. In meetings, he asked the kind of questions that didn't get answers, only glances. One morning, in a technical review session, he raised his hand. Has the thermal runoff report for Grid 3 been validated by an independent source? He asked. The room went still. Thomas Mercer, a manager with the kind of confidence only bureaucracy could breed, looked up with a tight smile. We use our own protocols now. Henry, faster, leaner. Henry didn't blink. Faster doesn't mean better, especially if it compromises safety. Thomas let out a soft chuckle, the kind meant to fill space without meaning. Look, I get it, you're from the old school. Ethics, peer review, all that, but this isn't Cormax, and we're not building engines anymore. We're building influence. Try to keep up. The room laughed politely. Henry said nothing. Afterward, as people filtered out, a young tech named Maya lingered near the door. She was quiet, had kept her head down the entire meeting. Now, she stepped closer. Mr. Mathers, she said quietly, be careful with Thomas. He doesn't just manage engineers. He manages messages. He's close with Victor. Too close. Henry nodded, thanked her, and made a mental note. Later that night, back home, Emily leaned over his shoulder as they reviewed the internal server logs she'd managed to download. Her expression was tight, lips pressed together. This system's more locked down than it looks. She said, there are message channels marked, executive only. But someone's been routing data through side threads. Henry rubbed his temples. You mean someone's hiding things inside the system? Emily nodded. Exactly. He stared at the screen for a long time before shutting the laptop. That's how it always starts. Little leaks, quiet corridors. They both went to bed uneasy. At 3:17 a.m., Henry's phone buzzed. Not a text, an email. The subject line was blank. No sender listed, just one line of text. Stop digging. Some truths aren't worth it, especially if you want your granddaughter to stay safe. Henry sat up in bed, the light from the screen casting sharp lines across his face. He read it again, then again, and the silence in the room felt heavier than anything he'd heard in years. Henry didn't sleep much after the email. Something about it lodged in the back of his throat, like a fishbone too small to choke on but impossible to ignore. He didn't mention it to Emily. He couldn't, not yet. Instead, he quietly started keeping a separate notebook, one he tucked behind the old radio in the garage. Every conversation, every odd look, every file he reviewed went into that book. He backed up emails on an external drive he bought with cash. There was no such thing as being too careful now. A week passed. The air around Voltrix buzzed with something more than fluorescent lights and corporate slogans. Flyers were posted, invitations were sent. Voltrix was going public with its biggest move yet, a state-funded program called the Green Infrastructure Initiative. The press release called it a revolution. The staff called it a parade. The event was set on a Friday, hosted at the company's central campus with an outdoor stage, catering trucks, and rows of folding chairs aligned like a Sunday revival. Local reporters milled about with cameras slung over shoulders. The mayor showed up in a gray suit that didn't quite fit, smiling like he had stock in the project. Everyone clapped at the right times. No one asked real questions. Henry stood toward the back, arms crossed, a baseball cap low over his eyes. He watched as Richard gave the opening remarks, painting a picture of sustainability, ethics, and innovation. It all sounded noble, clean, but it rang hollow after what he'd seen buried beneath the surface. Then Victor Dane took the stage. Henry's stomach turned. Victor wore a navy blazer. No tie. The confident swagger of someone who knew exactly how much of the room he owned. He spoke of the future like he'd invented it. His voice was smooth, practiced, his message simple. Voltrix represents a new era. One where progress doesn't compromise integrity. Where we don't just build technology, we build trust. The crowd applauded. Henry felt like he was watching a magician pull a rabbit from a hat he'd filled with snakes. As the event wrapped, Henry slipped toward the parking lot, hoping to leave before Victor spotted him. He wasn't quick enough. "Henry," a voice called. He turned. Victor was walking toward him, one hand in his pocket, the other extended in casual greeting. "Wasn't sure you'd show," he said, smiling like they were old friends bumping into each other at a diner. Henry didn't take the hand. Didn't come for the speech. Victor didn't miss a beat. Still straight to the point. "That's what I always liked about you." Henry stayed quiet. Victor's voice dropped slightly. "Listen, I know the past wasn't ideal. But the game's change. This company's different. The world's different." Henry met his eyes. "Some things shouldn't be recycled." Victor chuckled. "The idealism is still there. That's good. But let me give you a little advice. Man to man. Sometimes survival matters more than being right." He gave a friendly tap to Henry's shoulder and walked off before Henry could reply. The ride home was quiet. Henry kept checking his mirrors. The same black SUV had made every turn he had. When he sped up, it did too. When he slowed, it lagged just enough to stay back. At a four-way stop, he pulled into a gas station. The SUV rolled past. No plates he could catch. Just tinted windows and a shadow behind the wheel. He didn't tell Emily. Again. But that night, while she was upstairs studying, he opened his laptop to check the day's news. There it was. Front page of a mid-sized tech blog. Linked directly in Voltrix's internal network. Exclusive. Former engineer Henry Mathers fired over embezzlement allegations. The article was slick. Too slick. It quoted unnamed sources from Cormax, referenced fake financial records, and painted Henry as a disgruntled, bitter man who'd once tried to funnel company money through unauthorized maintenance accounts. Within hours, the story was shared across company chats, reposted in internal forums, and forwarded in staff emails with thinly veiled sarcasm. Henry didn't need confirmation to know who was behind it. He just sat there, staring at the screen, hands still. They weren't just playing defense anymore. Now, they were coming for his name. By Monday morning, the air around Henry had changed. It wasn't loud or sudden. Just quieter. Fewer greetings in the hallway. Averted eyes in the break room. Emails unanswered. No one said anything directly. But the message was clear enough. Something had shifted. And he was now on the wrong side of it. By noon, an official notice hit his inbox. It was dressed in polite language, wrapped in HR jargon. But it landed like a hammer. Effective immediately. Mr. Henry Mathers will be placed under temporary performance review to ensure all team members continue to uphold Voltrix's commitment to transparency and workplace integrity. It didn't take much to read between the lines. They were sidelining him, isolating him, soft suspension in a shiny envelope. He printed the message, folded it into his pocket, and walked out without a word. At home, Emily was already waiting. She stood in the kitchen, pale-faced, her backpack still hanging from one shoulder. "They called me to the principal's office," she said quietly. "Someone emailed them that article. Said they were concerned about my emotional environment at home." Her voice cracked at the end. She dropped her backpack, hands clenched at her sides. "I told them it wasn't true. That none of it was. I told them what kind of man you are. But they just looked at me like I didn't get it." Henry moved to put a hand on her shoulder. But she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him first. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she pulled back, eyes shining. "If you don't keep fighting, Grandpa, they'll do this to someone else. Someone who doesn't have anybody." Henry nodded slowly, something in his chest hardening. That evening, he drove across town to find Luis. The young engineer had been quiet since the article surfaced. And now Henry's messages went unanswered. The address in Luis's file led to a small duplex at the edge of town. Windows dark, yard overgrown. A woman in her 50s opened the door. Her expression shifted the moment she saw Henry. "You're the one he worked with," she said. Henry nodded. "I was hoping to speak with him. It's important." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. "He left last night, packed a bag, didn't say where he was going. Said it was safer that way." Henry stepped back, heart sinking. She held out a folded piece of paper. "He told me if anyone came asking, anyone I trusted, I should give them this." Back in his truck, Henry unfolded the page carefully. Luis's handwriting was sharp and slanted. The note was short, but what it said hit like a brick. "There's a side channel in the payment system. Not standard payroll, routed through an external partner. Greenbridge Logistics. All approvals go through Victor Dane." He read it twice, then tucked it inside his wallet. The next morning, Henry walked into the Voltrix regional office, not the field center, but the administrative tower. He didn't wear a visitor badge, didn't check in. He walked straight to the records department and asked for Renee, a name he'd heard in whispers from engineers who'd been here long enough to remember when the place was smaller and quieter. Renee was in her late 40s, with tired eyes and a cardigan covered in coffee stains. She looked up from her desk, surprised but not alarmed. "I need a copy of any transaction reports tied to Greenbridge Logistics over the last 2 quarters." Henry said softly, "I'm still listed as senior technical consultant, aren't I?" She stared at him a moment, then glanced over her shoulder toward the glass wall behind her. "I don't trust what's going on either," she whispered, "but I can't be seen giving this to you." She slipped a stack of papers into a plain folder, sealed it, and handed it over. Henry nodded once. "Thank you." She said nothing more. That night, Henry double-checked every door and window before heading to bed. He hid the folder in the false bottom of his old tool chest. He kept his voice low when Emily asked about it. Said only, "I'm getting close." But close had a price. At 2:14 a.m., a crash jolted him awake. He grabbed the flashlight by his nightstand and crept toward the back of the house. The door to the garage was open. He was sure he'd locked it. The shelves were knocked over, boxes pulled apart, cabinets swung open, but nothing seemed missing. Not until he opened the old radio compartment. The notebook was gone. So was the external hard drive where he'd stored every email. Every recording, every scanned file, vanished, clean. All that remained was a single sheet of paper, taped to the center of the workbench. It read, in heavy black ink, "This is your final warning." Henry stood there for a long time, breath steady but shallow, the paper fluttering slightly in the draft from the cracked window. They weren't just watching anymore. They'd come inside. The morning after the break-in, Henry sat at the kitchen table, coffee going cold in his hands, staring at the empty space where the radio used to sit. Emily had left early for school, quieter than usual, like she sensed the silence wasn't just from fatigue. Henry hadn't told her what was missing. Not yet. He knew now. He couldn't do this alone anymore. Whatever lines had been drawn, he had already crossed them. If they were willing to come into his house, they were ready for more. And so, before the coffee turned lukewarm, he pulled out his flip phone, the one he hadn't touched in years. He scrolled through the contacts until he found a name he'd buried with time and caution. Clara Jennings. Years ago, she was one of the most relentless investigative journalists on the West Coast. The kind that didn't just chase stories, she peeled them open. She vanished from the public eye after a cyber attack left her exposed. Her sources compromised, and her life upended. Last he heard, she'd taken up work as a ghost editor for nonprofit research papers and moved to a cabin out near the edge of Mendocino. He called once. No answer. He called again. She picked up. There was a pause before she spoke. "Henry Mathers. That's a name I didn't expect to hear again. I need your help," he said. Another pause. "Is this about Cormax?" "It's about something bigger." By noon, he was on the road to meet her. Clara hadn't changed much, at least not where it counted. Her hair was silver now, tied back in a loose bun, and her eyes sharper than he remembered. She let him in without ceremony and poured them both strong tea. Not bothering with small talk. "If I help," she said, "you tell me everything, not just about Voltrix, about Cormax, what really happened." He nodded, and for the first time in over a decade, Henry told the full story. How he'd uncovered misappropriated funds in the engineering division at Cormax. How the numbers didn't add up. How he'd followed the trail until it led to a vice president with ties to shady procurement firms. How he'd made the mistake of confronting that VP in private. How, within a week, his system credentials were revoked. A fake audit was leaked. And a charge of unauthorized budget manipulation landed in his file. No trial, no defense, just silence and a severance check. Clara didn't interrupt. She only scribbled notes in a worn leather journal and asked, once, Victor Dane? Henry nodded. He was there then. He's here now. That evening, Emily joined them. Clara showed her how to set up a remote encrypted backup on an external drive, hidden inside a reprogrammed Wi-Fi router. Together, the three of them built a digital wall around their data and started rebuilding what had been taken. Henry retyped his physical notes from memory. Emily searched the company's open APIs for public contracts tied to Greenbridge Logistics. Clara dug into corporate filings and found a shell firm, GreenTech Alliance, listed as a third-party developer for Voltrix's sustainability projects. It's all flowing through here, Clara muttered. GreenTech bills Voltrix. The money disappears into consulting fees and offshore licensing. Nobody blinks. They began connecting names to contracts, faces to signatures. Clara showed them news archives that never made the front page, 3 whistleblowers who'd spoken out about Victor in past ventures. Each time, the pattern repeated. He'd brand them unstable, bitter, dishonest. Stories would leak, reputations would rot. That's what he does, Clara said. He doesn't silence people, he stains them, then lets the world walk away. Henry stared at the screen. That's what he's doing to me. He drafted a message, simple, unsigned, and sent it to every old technician he could remember from his Cormax days. Just a few lines. If you've ever questioned a transfer, a missing number, a name on a form, please reach out. You're not alone. 2 days passed. Nothing. Then, finally, a reply. Her name was Joanne Keats. She'd worked in mid-level finance at Voltrix until last year, when she refused to approve a transfer that didn't make sense. Within weeks, she'd been reassigned to a lower-tier office 3 counties away. Quietly, without explanation, they agreed to meet, on the way to the diner where they were scheduled to talk. Clara's phone rang. She pulled over to take the call. Henry watched her expression shift as she listened, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. She hung up and turned to him, voice low. A man named Elias Hunt, internal security, used to be one of Victor's top guys. Henry blinked. I remember that name. What about him? He was found dead in his office this morning. Cardiac arrest. They're calling it. But get this. The surveillance feed crashed 10 minutes before it happened. Power surge. Apparently. Henry didn't speak. Clara looked down at her phone again. That's 2 people gone. Luis and now Elias. One disappeared. The other's dead. She started the car. Voice steady but cold. This isn't a corporate cover-up anymore. Henry. He didn't reply. Just stared out the window as streetlights passed by in flickers. One after the next. Like slow blinks in the dark. Henry watched the news report replay on the small TV screen in Clara's cabin. The words, apparent suicide, scrolling beneath the photo of Elias Hunt. There was something disturbingly casual about how quickly the media had accepted the story. A man, once Victor Dane's close associate, dead at his desk. No questions asked. That sealed it for Henry. This wasn't just about dirty ledgers anymore. It was about fear, control, silence. Clara turned off the TV and looked at Henry without saying a word. She didn't have to. They both understood what this meant. If we don't act now, she finally said, we might not get another chance. Henry shook his head slowly. Not yet. Clara frowned. You're still holding back? If we go public now, with what we have, he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose, they'll spin it. Say I'm just a disgruntled ex-employee. We need more than documents. We need witnesses, patterns, something undeniable, something that tears them apart from the inside. It was Clara's turn to stay quiet. Henry looked up. We turn the system on itself. Let it choke on its own secrets. The idea came together fast. They would stage a training session, under the guise of a technical refresher course, for former Voltrix engineers who had been quietly dismissed over the last few years. Clara worked through encrypted forums and private channels, while Emily used her social media savvy to mask the invitations under layers of legitimate-sounding language. They booked a low-key co-working space 2 towns over, enough to look harmless but private enough to speak freely. Of the 23 people invited, 9 showed up, nervous, hesitant, but curious. Some of them had never spoken to each other before. But by the end of the first hour, the stories started flowing. Same pattern. Untraceable directives. Orders signed by vague authorizations. Documents disappearing from shared drives. And then, after a few too many questions, sudden reassignments or firings. A woman named Alina brought a printed internal memo that had her name redacted as a sender, something she said she never saw until after she left. A former safety officer named Jonah shared a photo of a shipping manifest he'd found suspicious, green energy batteries supposedly going to research facilities that didn't exist. They were building something more than a case. They were building context, a web, a pattern. Henry could feel it, like piecing together a cracked windshield to see the road ahead again. While Clara transcribed testimonies and cataloged evidence, Emily dug deeper into the data archive Henry had salvaged. Buried among older log files, she found something that nearly made her drop her laptop. "Grandpa," she said, spinning the screen toward him. "This isn't just backup data." He squinted. "Real-time authorization logs?" "Exactly. From the internal command system. These weren't manually entered, they were time-stamped by the primary finance server. If we can verify that server still exists," Clara added, "we can prove it came from inside. That Victor didn't just approve shady payments, he did it through official channels." Henry nodded slowly. "Then we show it to the right people." That night, Henry received a phone call. The number was unlisted. He nearly let it go to voicemail. But something told him to pick up. It was Richard Langston. "I'd like you to come to our headquarters," Richard said, voice calm and steady. "There are things we need to discuss. About the future." Henry didn't respond at first. Just held the phone in silence. "Henry," Richard continued, "this isn't about discipline or reprimand. I think you've been asking the right questions. I want us on the same side." Clara was cautious. "It smells like a trap," she said. "Maybe Victor got to him. Or maybe he was never really out." Emily, arms crossed, looked at her grandfather with worry. "You don't have to go." "I know," Henry said, "but I'm going anyway." The Voltrix headquarters was a monolith of glass and metal, sharp against the gray sky like a blade on its edge. Henry arrived mid-morning, his ID pre-cleared. No hiccups. But something felt off the second he stepped through the doors. No welcome team, no receptionist, just a security guard with a clipboard and a neutral stare. "This way, sir," the guard said. They led him through a maze of empty hallways and sealed conference rooms. No signs of a meeting. No familiar faces, just sterile quiet. Finally, the guard opened a door and gestured inside. Henry stepped in. There, seated comfortably in an armchair across the small lounge-like room, was Victor Dane. He smiled, calm as ever. "I didn't think you'd come this far," he said, "but here you are." Victor tilted his head slightly. "You always were a stubborn one. Thought your little workshop down south would keep you out of the game. But people like you, you don't disappear. You fester." Henry didn't answer. He stared, reading the room, calculating. Victor stood up, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve. "I'll make this simple. You walk away now. I'll make sure the last few years of your life stay quiet. Comfortable. Nobody needs to get hurt." "And if I don't?" Henry asked. Victor's smile didn't change. "Well," he said, "then I guess we both get to find out what it costs to believe in something." The room was so quiet Henry could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Victor had dropped his charm the moment the door clicked shut behind them. Gone was the disarming smile. What sat across from Henry now was the real man. Or at least the version he saved for moments like this, polished, calm, and dangerous. Victor leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Henry, we're not here to argue about the past. What matters is what comes next. I'm offering you a place in that future." Henry didn't respond. Victor continued. "You've got experience, respect, even if it's been dulled over time. I can fix that." We name you Senior Technical Advisor. We give you a public statement clearing your name from the Cormac's mess. Hell, we'll even say we brought you in to help rebuild integrity. All you have to do is walk away. Let this drop." Henry stared at him. "You think this is about my reputation?" Victor shrugged. "Everyone wants something. Henry, you've been chasing ghosts for years. I'm giving you peace." Henry leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "If you think I'm in this to polish my legacy, you've never understood a damn thing about me." Victor's smile disappeared. The room shifted. He sat back, eyes now sharp. "Then you've just chosen how your story ends." Outside, Clara sat in her car, fingers tapping the dashboard as she stared at her phone. Henry hadn't checked in. No text, no call. Too long. She opened a tracking app tied to a backup phone Henry always carried. The blinking dot was buried somewhere in the lower levels of Voltrix's main building, below public access. She cursed under her breath and reached for her laptop. Meanwhile, across town, Emily sat in the corner of a busy coffee shop, typing furiously. She sent out a short press release under an anonymous tip: Voltrix whistleblowers to reveal internal fund misappropriation. Emergency press conference expected. Within minutes, keywords began trending. A swarm of reporters started calling Voltrix's media line. Cameras were being packed, engines revved, pressure was on. Back at headquarters, phones were ringing off the hook. Executive assistants scrambled, trying to contain the flood of inquiries. Someone knocked on the conference room door. Then, without waiting, it opened. Richard Langston walked in. His appearance shifted the air in the room. The founder of Voltrix rarely showed up to internal disputes in person, let alone unannounced. He closed the door behind him and stood between the two men. "Victor," Richard said plainly, "I just saw the press cycle. Want to tell me why we're suddenly national news?" Victor stood, clearing his throat. "Some disgruntled former employee is." Richard held up a hand. "No spin, just facts. The green infrastructure budget, the report you submitted to the board, how much of that was real?" Victor's jaw tightened. "The funds were allocated as outlined. We've delivered on key milestones. Any confusion likely stems from incomplete context." Henry reached into his bag. "Let me save you both some time." He placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside were transcripts of statements, time-stamped data logs from the finance server, and a USB drive. "This," Henry said, "is from Joanne, one of your own. She refused to process fraudulent payments. Got reassigned to an office with no windows. That drive holds logs showing that entire budget was funneled through shell accounts under GreenTech Alliance, none of which show any traceable product." Richard didn't speak right away. He picked up the USB, held it between his fingers. "I trusted you," he said to Victor. "You told me we were building something ethical, something that would outlast us both." Victor tried to regain control. "I kept this place alive while you were dreaming of utopias. I built this on results." Richard's expression hardened. "And if this is true, you also built it on lies." He turned to the security officer waiting outside the door. "Escort Mr. Dane to legal. Effective immediately. He's suspended pending full review." Victor didn't argue, but as he stood, he locked eyes with Henry. "This won't change anything," he muttered. "You think pulling off one layer means the rot's gone?" Henry didn't answer. Victor walked out. Richard sat back down, breathing through his nose, trying to keep his composure. He looked at the open folder again. Then Henry noticed something on the file server list on Richard's monitor. A recently accessed document, one he recognized. He clicked it without asking. The approval logs for the Green Infrastructure Program. Only the final signature wasn't Victor's. It was Richard's. Richard looked at him, face frozen. Henry's voice was quiet. It wasn't just Victor. Richard slowly closed the laptop. "Let's talk," he said, the warmth gone from his voice. Henry sat in the kitchen, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee gone cold. The radio hummed low in the background, catching pieces of the morning news. Voltrix's name floated in and out, mixed with words like accountability, transparency, and corporate reform. The tone was triumphant. A scandal had been, swiftly and responsibly handled. The narrative was clean, digestible, perfect for headlines. But Henry knew better. They had made Victor the face of it all, the villain with a clean exit. The headlines might say the storm had passed. But he saw the calm for what it really was: managed silence. Victor had become a scapegoat, swept off stage while the real machinery kept humming behind the curtain. Later that afternoon, Richard Langston requested a private meeting. They sat in the same glass office overlooking the Voltrix main plaza where technicians walked beneath the illusion of a new era. "I owe you something," Richard began, pouring them both a cup of tea. "Whatever the history between us, your stubbornness brought light into places we weren't looking. For that, I'm grateful." Henry didn't touch the tea. Richard offered him a contract, senior advisor to the board. Flexible terms, full benefits, discreet. "Voltrix is entering a new chapter," he said. "Help us shape it the right way." Henry looked him straight in the eye. He wanted to believe the offer was genuine, that Richard had been nothing more than a man who took his eyes off the wheel for too long. But he saw something behind the polished words. A trace of calculation, of containment. He slid the papers back. "I came here to expose a lie," Henry said, "not to manage it politely." Richard didn't argue. He only nodded, a little slower than usual, and said, "If you change your mind, my door's always open." But Henry wouldn't. That night, he typed his resignation. No drama, no press release, just a quiet farewell to the engineers he'd met, the few still willing to whisper the truth. Attached was a public letter addressed to all technical staff. If a system must hide the truth to function, the letter read, then it is not a system worth protecting. The cost of silence is always paid by those who can least afford it. Be better, speak louder, keep each other honest. He signed it with his name, and nothing else. Emily helped him post it. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked send. It spread fast, quietly at first, then with more force. Former employees reached out. Names long buried in HR files resurfaced. Clara was already drafting the first article. They launched a blog together, Truth Underneath. Emily curated it. Clara wrote, and Henry. He stayed in the background, answering questions, reviewing files, reaching out to those who still carried pieces of the story. Voltrix responded, of course. A polished press conference, complete with prepared remarks and polished speakers. They said the matter had been resolved, that internal reviews were complete, that the company was proud to have taken swift action. No mention of Henry, not one word. Weeks passed, the buzz faded, the next news cycle rolled in, and Voltrix's image began to recover. Then, one rainy evening, Henry found a plain envelope waiting in his mailbox. No name, no return address. Inside was a single folder. No note, no signature. Just copies of internal planning memos. Heavily redacted, but not enough. He saw dates, names, line items from projected budgets. Strategic Infrastructure Initiative, Western Division. 3 new states. Same shell funds. Same pipeline of quiet money. He closed the folder and stared at the clock on the wall. Its second hand clicked forward like a metronome. Patient and indifferent, Emily stepped into the kitchen, a bowl of popcorn in her hands. Another quiet night? Henry didn't answer right away. He looked out the window. The sky a dull charcoal. The kind that whispered secrets if you knew how to listen. Then he said it, not to her. Not even fully to himself. But to whatever was still watching from the darkness. The truth never dies. It just waits for someone stubborn enough to dig one layer deeper. He reached for his coat. There was still work to be done. And maybe that's the real story here, not about power or corruption, but about how truth has a way of surviving, even when it's buried deep under layers of silence and fear. Henry didn't win awards. He didn't get his name in headlines. But he walked away with something far more valuable: integrity that couldn't be bought. And a legacy that quietly challenges others to do the same. What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments. We read every one. And if stories like this move you, make sure to subscribe to Undercover Truths so you won't miss the next one. The fight for what's right is far from over.